Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Great to see you again. I'm more than pleased to be convening for another one of our beautiful sessions of wonder and discovery. And sadly, while I could spend the entirety of this stream imparting words of wisdom to you about the meaning of life and how to achieve one's highest potential, there are maybe some other more pressing issues at hand that it's worth discussing. That's what I'll do here. I hate to sound like a broken record about some of this stuff. And frankly, I sort of wish or long to be able to cover other topics. But when you see such an in your face trend that doesn't seem to be getting appropriate coverage from most of the conventional media, there's something that tugs at you to give it your, let's say, undivided attention for at least a period where it's of most acute concern. And that, of course, is these states of emergency, which we're now approaching the 2-year mark of being in full effect. Not in every jurisdiction, but in enough jurisdictions that it's really an ominous portent as to how these emergency powers are being implanted into just ordinary systems of government that's kind of permanent fixtures of how life operates. And I wanted to talk about one particularly egregious example from just this week. Okay, so just this week, there was yet another extension, prolongation, perpetuation of fairly drastic emergency powers in a full state, New Jersey. Okay. And it's not just that the powers were extended, because plenty of government bodies across the country have been doing that on the city, state, and even national level. But it was the manner in which this extension occurred that I think is very instructive and should, at the very least, be cause for extreme skepticism as to the stated rationale for why these governmental emergency powers remain supposedly necessary. But you don't see a whole lot of scrutiny applied to them. Now, what am I talking about? Well, we're in the supposed Omicron wave, oh my gosh wave, oh come on wave. I tend to call it the oh come on wave, as you may know. And it started in earnest really on the East Coast, right? So New Jersey is on the East Coast, and we're told, frantically is having giant upticks right now in positive cases and the like. It seems like people are beginning to come around to the idea that case metrics are not informative and, in fact, maybe disinformative. But guess what? Doesn't matter for the purposes of government officials like the governor, Phil Murphy, who is using the same old criteria that he used nearly 2 years ago in March 2020 to extend his emergency powers. Now, just to backtrack a bit, Murphy already did a kind of jujitsu move where he allowed, through an agreement with the state legislature in New Jersey, for certain emergency powers to expire this past June of 2021. But, pursuant to that legislative agreement, what happened was the legislature agreed that although the public health emergency would be rescinded, Murphy would nonetheless be allowed to maintain certain state of emergency power. So a state of emergency would be proclaimed, would remain in effect, but the public health emergency would be rescinded. Now, of course, most normal people are going to have no clue as to what the distinction is there. And most elected officials and most people who are in politics probably have no idea either, because it's very specific to New Jersey. But because that agreement was reached, what Murphy was allowed to do was maintain the requisite authorities on an emergency basis that enabled him to do stuff like continue to impose statewide mask mandates at schools and daycares and such. So that was derived from his maintenance of these emergency authorities. But now, but as a result of that agreement, all his powers, all his emergency powers, were set to expire on January 11th. So this week, that was the agreement. And so either Murphy had the choice of allowing those powers to expire and forfeiting his ability that he had maintained for nearly 2 years to kind of rule by decree, be a one-man governing operation, essentially in New Jersey, in charge of all these different aspects of, COVID emergency response that he's endowed with, or he could maybe contrive a way in which to extend these authorities. And initially, he was saying that these authorities of his, which he wanted to extend, were going to be done. The extension was going to be done in coordination with the legislature, right? Or in other words, the legislature, meaning the state Senate, the state assembly, was going to pass some bill that empowered Murphy to continue wielding these emergency authorities for X amount of time. But then he hit a bit of a roadblock. Despite the assembly and the Senate being controlled by fellow Democrats, they couldn't come to an agreement on extending the emergency powers. So what does Phil Murphy do? Well, he does what he did in March 2020. He declares a brand new state of emergency. So now he has all the same powers that he first proclaimed at the beginning of this thing. And as I wrote in a Rokfin item, which you can find on my channel, rokfin.com/Tracy, and you could also click over to the stream on Rokfin now if you're watching on YouTube, which is in the description box of the video on YouTube. As I mentioned in that piece, and maybe people will quibble with this or even reject it outright, for whatever misuse of COVID governmental powers that there have plainly been over the past 2 years, the incoherence of the rationale for various measures, or the overexertions of power, or the consolidation of these authorities on dubious grounds, whatever your criticisms are in that vein, and I have many myself, I think it's still nonetheless fair to acknowledge that at the beginning, so in March, April 2020, there was a genuine problem in New Jersey where the hospitals were being, inundated with a wave of patients, and there was a genuine issue. So that you could at least understand would be a situation that would be merited to have a governor potentially declare emergency authorities. But now we're almost 2 years later. We just went through a full mass vaccination campaign that everybody's being hectored to comply with. We have all these advances in different kind of therapeutics and different ways of dealing with COVID to the extent that it's a threat. And yet, what does Murphy do? He declares the exact same authorities that was declared in 2020. Now, if that's not troubling to you, even if you're the biggest COVID hawk in the world, right? Even if you think that this is the most existential threat that you or I or anyone on earth will ever have to deal with, I think you would at least have pause about what it means for one person to consolidate such uninterrupted unilateral power in his governance of a state for this long. But that doesn't seem to have occurred to many people. But here's the kicker, okay? Because you can find other examples of similar things happening throughout the country. But this really is the kicker in why this is particularly egregious. I mentioned that Murphy appeared to need a rationale to contrive to justify why he was extending these powers, right? Because although the democratically controlled legislature didn't block him, there were murmurings of discontent with potentially the kind of indefinite extension of these powers. So what was that contrivance? Well, I'll tell you exactly, because I had email exchanges just today with officials from the New Jersey Department of Health, and that sheds light on what I'm getting at here. Starting on Monday of this week, you saw headlines Monday, Tuesday of this week, there were headlines going out, at full blast in the New Jersey media reporting that the New Jersey state health officials had announced that New Jersey was undergoing the most hospitalizations to this week than at any point since the beginning of the pandemic, right? So if that's true, and you're just an average citizen hearing that statement or looking at that headline, you can understand how that would be fairly disturbing, right? Because New Jersey had the worst death rate for quite a while at the beginning of this thing as a result of that first wave. So if the situation now is even worse in terms of hospitalizations, then gee whiz, that sounds like a genuine emergency. And maybe they could even justify the declaration of a state of emergency that empowers the governor to wield unilateral authority. And so that figure was trumpeted. Most hospitalizations since the beginning of the pandemic. And so like, wow, that really would stop you in your tracks and make you think that something serious is happening here. Well, here's what I got today in terms of clarification from a state official. Do you know that, first of all, less than half, at the time this was being trumpeted, this figure was being trumpeted, less than half of those reported hospitalizations, 49%, actually cited COVID as the primary diagnosis. And that would never have been known unless journalists inquired about it, unless they pressed the relevant officials to differentiate between hospitalizations that were primarily COVID or COVID be the primary diagnosis versus incidental admissions, which now more and more people are understanding is a extremely common thing, where you go to the hospital for some totally unrelated cause, everything from a broken leg to a gunshot wound, and if you happen to test positive for COVID, which is not all that unlikely given the ubiquity of this variant, we're told, and its transmissibility and how widespread it is, then you get counted as a COVID hospital admission. When it turns out, when you actually delve a little bit deeply into the data, even the New Jersey state officials, the health department officials, admit that it was less than half of that grand figure that was being touted that supposedly constituted the most hospitalizations since the beginning of the pandemic, okay? Now, why is it important that this figure was being cited at this time? Well, as I mentioned, the governor's emergency authorities expired on January 11th. He had to contrive a rationale for extending them. So what did he do? Well, he issued a new executive order. And if you look at that order, can you guess what it says? Hazard a wild guess, because I think if you're smart, and I assume my audience are the people who would take the time out of their important schedules to listen to a broadcast like this, very intelligent people. Let me just share with you what it says in this executive order, extending Murphy's emergency powers again for approaching 2 years straight. It says that New Jersey is experiencing, quote, the highest number of hospitalizations since the start of the pandemic. That's the refrain. That is the scary sounding refrain, right? That most people who are not, avid or particularly sophisticated news consumers would find concerning, understandably. But that's a phony stat. Or at the very least, it's such a deliberately inflated stat, such a misleadingly exaggerated stat that it ought to be regarded as effectively phony. Particularly if it's going to be cited in a executive order to continue these emergency authorities. It's like a fraud, basically. Like, if you're going to extend your emergency authorities, why not just be truthful about it? Well, maybe because the rationale otherwise would be somewhat flimsy. So we just had this amazing coincidence with Murphy, where on the day that his powers were going to expire, he's gifted with this scary seeming stat that actually, upon slightly further inspection, collapses. So if you go over to Rokfin now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about why you should be highly cognizant of this not just in terms of whether you're a New Jersey resident, but for broader national implications.